Welcome to Bogan Intel. Today we're joined by Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology and Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute in Beijing. Warwick has been writing extensively about the U.S. China trade tensions, the decline of U.S. global influence, and the rise of a multipolar world order. With recent U.S. tariffs threatening Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme, ongoing trade disputes with China, and shifting alliances like the ASEAN-GCC-China Summit, the global landscape is changing rapidly, and Warwick's insights offer unique perspectives on these developments and their implications for Australia. Let's dive in. Thanks for joining us today, Warwick Powell, and welcome to Bogan Intelligentsia.
Been an absolute pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have someone like you on board, and I've been watching you from afar, like many Australians, and some of your work, which is quite profound, looking at the Indo-Pacific and the region around. And I'd like to get exploring into that a little bit today. I would like to start off at the trade tensions at the moment developing between Australia and the United States. Recent U.S. tariffs on medicines have been something that's popped up this week, which could impact, the lifeblood of Australia's pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Are you able to explain some of the consequences of these tariffs for Australian consumers, the healthcare costs, and is this tariff a policy aimed at undermining the PBS via Washington, or is it a broader consequence of these US trade strategies?
Yeah, look, on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme specifically, it is an attempt by Washington to use significant policy levers to force the Australian government to abandon the way in which it procures pharmaceuticals internationally and makes them available to Australian citizens and others who are in Australia. And the PBS scheme, in effect, is an aggregate buying scheme, right? Administered and run by government, and they add products to it, which then are made available at publicly subsidised rates. The issue for the American big pharmaceuticals industry is that, from their point of view, that undermines their opportunity to maximise retail profits in the Australian environment, and the PBS scheme is now framed as something of a non-tariff barrier to free market access by American pharmaceutical companies. It is a test of national sovereignty, of course, because it is a challenge to the extent to which the Australian Commonwealth government can govern the inflows and outflows of things, number one, and the rules and mechanisms by which it can administer that, and particularly in the area of healthcare, which for the best part of about 50 years now, I guess, since the advent of Medicare, has really become a foundational and quite distinctly Australian public good. So far, it would seem that there is bipartisan determination to reject or to stand up to the pressure that's being applied from Washington. And I guess there's nobody in the mainstream political world in Australia that would be game to be seen to be undermining the pharmaceuticals benefit scheme. Whether that holds or not, I guess time will tell. But the other interesting thing about the way that tariffs seem to be unfolding insofar as Australia is concerned is that whilst Washington is imposing tariffs on goods that are exported from Australia to the United States, the Australian government has so far refused to implement reciprocal moves, namely to impose tariffs on goods that come from America to Australia. And they're doing that on the basis that imposing tariffs on goods from America to Australia would actually achieve very little in terms of negotiations with the United States. But probably more importantly than that, it's a recognition that tariffs are a cost on buyers, whether they're enterprises or household consumers. And this is a lesson Australia's actually learned over the last 40 to 50 years, is that tariffs ultimately are an impost on buyers and are unnecessary as a result.
These the PBS here being something you said a bipartisan agreement around preserving. No one would have the gall in challenging such a thing. So we've seen, in the miasma of the developing Australia-US relationship, we have seen, the acquiescence around the military from Miles, around AUKUS. We've seen the Albanese government play a small target around some of these issues in order not to get wedged from the coalition or the media. But with the Medicare PBS issue, it seems like Labor has, Albanese went around through that election campaign holding up that Medicare card. He wouldn't let go of it. There is an optics around this PBS here that is potentially different and will be driving us forward in the national interest. Do you think it may be a moment, a clear moment where Australia sort of draws a line in the sand?
Look, you'd be crazy as an Australian politician, I would have thought anyway, to leave yourself open to being accused of undermining the Medicare system and the accessibility of low-cost healthcare. So it is something that I think both sides of the political fence in Australia is going to actually hold the line on. The domestic political costs are simply too high. Now, what does that mean? Well, it might mean that there will be considerations for concessions in other parts of the relationship with the United States as a way of offsetting this particular determination to not budge on the pharmaceuticals question. And I guess that's going to be an area of some public interest and public concern as to what it is that Canberra may be willing to make concessions on so as to keep the PBS out of America's reach ultimately.
Maybe worrying. Hopefully, it's not going to be an increase in our military budget as per the GDP, as may have been ruled out. But yeah, any kind of concessions to the US pharma lobbies or anything like that would only be probably a detrimental sort of scenario for us. So these compromises could play out to be just as potentially difficult or just as potentially non-beneficial for Australia in the long run.
Yeah, look, I don't think that there's any easy issues anymore on the table from Australia's point of view in relation to the United States. Obviously, the pharmaceutical issue that we've just been talking about is a major challenge to the way that Australia views itself as a society and the things that it prioritises as important public goods. So that's one issue. The second one goes to Australia's broader understanding of its own national interest, particularly around economics and trade, which is that Australia is a trading nation. And really, this question of being an open trading nation was settled probably 50 years or so ago when the Whitlam government actually led the charge with the first round of tariff cuts, and which then were continued, particularly during the Hawke and Keating governments, and the sort of long prior history from the late 1800s through to, say, the 1970s, where protectionism was a dominant feature of Australian public policy, gave way. And Australia, ever since then, has been largely a beneficiary of being an open trading nation. And as a result of that, too, it's benefited from there being a relatively stable multilateral trading environment at a global and also at regional levels. That particular set of institutions is now under some pressure from the United States. I wouldn't necessarily say threat. Sometimes people talk about the WTO basically being threatened by the moves coming out of Washington, but I suspect that the WTO, for different reasons, has its own inertia, as well as its own strengths that will enable it to withstand the pressure from Washington. But nonetheless, the Australian national economy and Australian public welfare has been a significant beneficiary of those trading rules and the ability for Australia to prosecute its disputes within the context of those rules. The United States is literally seeking to pull the rug out from that set of systems, and Australia really needs to hold its ground to defend not only the global system, but Australia will defend that because it's in Australia's national interest to defend the global system. And that will put it at odds again with Washington. So on economic policy questions, the gap between Washington's own priorities for itself and the implications that that has for others, including Australia, continues to widen.
There will be a bigger cleavage a more of a direct impasse between Australia's national objectives and America's objectives to preserve its primacy. So there feels like we are coming to that moment of progressive patriotism here, where we might see something in the Australia first sort of landscape for the first time in potentially decades. I want to speak to you about Australia's alignment with Washington and how that could affect our Asian partnerships in the multilateral era. Um, Australia's support for Washington, blank checks, particularly around its alliance with the U.S. policy on Israel, and the lack of condemnation around Gaza. I'm talking about our neighbours like Malaysia and Indonesia. Uh, how has this raised questions about our credibility as a trustworthy partner in Asia? And how is this stance affecting Australia's relationships with Asian nations? Particularly when we're sort of scratching around ASEAN again. I see Penny Wong looking to engage with Southeast Asia and BRICS. Could this alignment sort of undermine Australia's ability to function effectively and to look forward in the national interest?
I think broadly speaking, there is a something of an unresolved contradiction at the heart of Australian foreign policy, and and from time to time that particular contradiction becomes more acute than at other times. The contradiction is best exemplified by really two views that exist within the official public policy posture. So on the one hand, you've got the view emanating mainly from the Department of Foreign Affairs, which is premised on the idea that the region in particular is already multipolar, that there is no single hegemon, and that there is a need, therefore, for Australia to navigate this new multilateral, multipolar ecosystem and to do that as deftly as it possibly can. In saying so, it also argues that the United States has a role to play in that multipolar environment, but as a balancing force rather than as a determinant or hegemonic force. So that's one view. The other view, emanating out of mainly the defense apparatuses, is that American primacy in Asia is either at risk or has been lost, and that Australia's national interests are best advanced by either preserving American primacy in the region or assisting America in reclaiming primacy in the region. And that is a view that I guess we could describe as a very sub-imperial attitude, which is that what's good for the United States in Asia is good for Australia. Now, these are contradictory views, and until these two particular worldviews are resolved, we're always going to be, we're always going to have one foot on each side of a barbed wire fence, to use an Australian colloquialism. Actually, my international friends look at me strangely when I describe the dilemma in those terms, but I know that, that you'll appreciate it acutely. So look, with both sides, with 2 feet, one on each side of the barbed wire fence, the balancing act is quite delicate, and the risks of slipping, of course, are quite serious. How does this play out in terms of Australia's uh, status and posture in Asia? Well, I think what it does is reinforces uh, a perception of Australia in capitals of Asia as being, in large part, an institutional and cultural legacy of Western colonialism. Uh, that's not to say that that's necessarily a critical perspective, but it's a recognition of the nature of the beast. So there is a sense that Australia is what it is. It is a settler, a white settler colony that had an orientation towards the British Empire for a long time, and which from the Second World War onwards turned to the United States as its great transatlantic protector. Now, all of that, of course, sits in the back of the minds of Asian capitals when they engage with Australia, and they're mindful of the fact that that Australia's cultural and strategic leanings are tied very much to that historical circumstance. Whether that amounts to baggage or not, I guess, really depends on the issue at hand. So if it's a question of, for instance, economic collaboration such as open trade, it probably doesn't play too big a role in impeding Australia's interactions with Asia, at least from an Asian perspective. And we've seen that with things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the free trade agreement between ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. But when it comes to other issues, such as regional security issues, I think it does create some points of tension where the Asian sense of particularly Asian or ASEAN primacy butts up against Australia's own institutional and historical leanings towards what is in effect an American primacy-based system in Asia. And that's not going to resolve particularly quickly, but I think it will resolve, well, the trajectory of historical forces is going to drive a resolution that will continue to see American primacy in the region and what's left of it diminish. And Australia will ultimately need to come to terms with that. Perhaps in some ways, the hope out of some people in Canberra is that firstly, we can kick that can down the road a little longer and hope that it'll be someone else's problem, not today's problem, and that the forces of history may ultimately resolve that issue for us, where American primacy literally just fades away, and all those things that animated the discussions in the 2010s and 2020s eventually become sort of historical curiosities, but ultimately not overly important. That's certainly the hope I think we find amongst certain sections of the intelligentsia in Canberra.
It seems like potentially that barbed wire fence could be electrified too at times, which isn't a good idea for the precarious balance. I do want to speak to essentially your article you wrote last year, China U.S Focus, My Way or the Highway, and how you looked at the decades of U.S efforts to contain China, how they've failed, and you question whether the current U.S administration can even engage China, in its own terms. Looking at the Rand Institute's simulations in the South China Sea, and the evolution of the argument from, say, when I was reading Michael Beckley a few years ago talking about China's inability to, gain regional maritime hegemony, and how this has changed, this mismatch that's happening here. Would a more constructive U.S.-China engagement, for starters, what would a more constructive U.S.-China engagement look like? And why does the U.S.'s current approach risk further strategic setbacks?
A more constructive approach between the US and China, I think, from a regional security point of view, would see the US withdraw its a military presence surrounding China. So I'm speaking from China's perspective. So that's what I would expect Beijing to see as a desirable outcome and a necessary outcome. And I'm talking about, for instance, the Philippines, where America has deployed, once again, medium-range missiles. And of course, the question of the island of Taiwan, which ultimately needs to be brought to a resolution, because otherwise it will remain the unresolved question of our region. It is one of the last pieces left of the post-colonial period that has not been fully resolved. Obviously, the Korean Peninsula is the other one, but these questions of post-colonial settlements in Asia and the final resolution of the conflicts that animated the region for large parts of the 20th century ultimately will need to be brought to a close so that the region itself can draw a line on a period of history and move forward. Now, maybe there is a détente to be had with the United States from a Chinese perspective around this, but that remains unclear as to how that might unfold. I mean, I've written a piece that explores one scenario around this, and that actually is underpinned by China circumnavigating the island of Taiwan in what it would describe as a defensive measure and what some of the possible implications of that are. But the United States has, I think, been actually engaged in a quiet process of regional retrenchment. It has been actually withdrawing its frontline troops from Okinawa. Its military capability in the region is substantially diminished compared to where it was even a decade ago, and certainly in relative terms. And interestingly, like it is doing in other parts of the world, it is increasing pressure on allies to step up to the mark and play a far greater role and commit more resources. So the United States, it seems to me, is looking to push allies to the front far more than historically was the case. And we're seeing that also in the change in the configuration of America's regional posture. So for the best part of the 7 decades after the Second World War, the structure of American security in Asia was very much a hubs and spokes model, in which the United States was at the center and it dealt with each of its allies or former colonies or client states or sub-imperial allies very much on a bilateral basis. That's changing, and it's changing as the United States seeks to create a network of multilateral, mini multilateral arrangements as a way of pushing out some responsibility, including resourcing responsibility, and by forcing others to step up to the plate, in effect, on America's behalf. Now, that is having some downstream effects as well, particularly in Japan and also in Korea, where that is opening up a window for policymakers in both of those countries to ask serious questions as to whether or not the United States is as dependable a security partner as it once was. And we're seeing in Japan some big question marks being raised about whether or not the long-term security of Japan can be built around the idea of American presence in Japan. And in Korea, there are lots of questions being asked around whether or not Korea can build its security arrangements around the idea that the United States, particularly its nuclear umbrella, will be mobilized to assist South Korea. The concern is that Washington simply is not going to put Washington or New York or Boston or Los Angeles on the front line in defense of Seoul. And therefore something else is going to have to be put in place. So the regional environment, Joel, I think is experiencing a level of flux that it arguably hasn't experienced for 30 plus years.
This geostrategic realignment in Japan and Korea seems to be very substantial. When we look at something like the Quad now, when we see countries like India and Japan, 2 members, they've got a foot in 2 camps at the moment, looking at the national interests and how to preserve Washington's demands upon them. Is Australia learning a little bit from this scenario right now and understanding that it's potentially in the same bracket as these countries as far as receiving US support or being, a viable option under the US security umbrella?
I think one of the most interesting things in Australia is the fact that there is now a much more vigorous and open public discussion about these questions than there has been for quite some time. I think that that's a constructive development, and it's a necessary one because the questions that are now on the table are obviously of critical importance to the long-term existential interests of Australia as a nation, but also in terms of Australia's potential future role within the region at large. And as the region itself evolves, Australia needs to be mindful of the kinds of institutions, either formal or informal, that are beginning to emerge. I wouldn't want to overplay for the time being what's happening in Korea and Japan, but it is nonetheless worth noting that what were questions that, well, the questions that are now being asked are probably things that 15 years ago would never have even been on the table, and that in and of itself, I think, is a significant development and an important sign that the, the 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 historical, quote, naturalness of the American security regime in Asia is now no longer seen as the natural order of things, and that something has given, and that new things will need to be contemplated. The other dynamics that I think are happening, and it's probably worth just bearing in mind, is that if you just take a look at what's happening in Southeast Asia first, the economies in that region, and I mean Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as Vietnam and others, they continue to develop and they're growing at rates faster than the Western world. And that development, in large part, is being underpinned by intensified economic integration with the Chinese economy, both in trade and investment terms. And we are seeing at a geopolitical level a commitment by important Southeast Asian economies or nations to institutions that are distinctly multipolar in nature, namely Indonesia becoming a full member of BRICS, Vietnam and Thailand also being partner nations to join China as one of the founders. So that's Southeast Asia. And of course, that matters to Australia because Australia is particularly keen to intensify its economic interactions with Southeast Asia. The Korean Peninsula and North Asia is also an important dimension with some different dynamics at play. So, beginning of last year, there was an underreported, but I think quite a significant event, and perhaps it'll become more significant as time goes by, when that is that Pyongyang has officially abandoned the idea of national reunification.
Yep.
So, from North Korea's point of view, from DPRK's perspective, there is an acceptance that, in fact, the Korean Peninsula now is two nations. That's an important policy position that, in some respects, opens out a space for a new form of diplomatic engagement that addresses the Korean Peninsula questions without the shadow of reunification. Having said that, Seoul has still not abandoned reunification as a policy, but the North has, and I think that can conceivably open up room for a new kind of dialogue. The other thing that's happening is the opening up of the Arctic and the ongoing development in Siberia, where the natural resources in terms of energy and food in that region will progressively become more available and accessible to countries of the region, meaning China and theoretically Japan and the Korean Peninsula as well. Now, those transformations are critical because the long run security of a nation is in large part underpinned by its ability to have enough fuel and food. And, machines need fuel and people need food, right? Without both of those things, you've got some real troubles. And the developments in Siberia actually offers northeast China, together with Japan and the Korean Peninsula, energy and food that will last them centuries to come. So there are fundamental economic and resource reasons that I think also open up possibilities for medium-term reconfiguration of what Asia looks like. Medium term meaning 20 to 30 years.
which also brings in another major player with the Arctic and the Siberia there, Russia, and their involvement with these neighboring countries, which has been, I suppose there's been a status quo that's been held there. Astonishing that we're looking at, America picking which island chain it might decide to delineate its new borders with China there, hopefully outside of the Taiwan Strait and closer towards Guam, where there can be a little bit more room to breathe. What you're sort of talking about here is all about really the declining U.S. strategic centrality.
Yeah.
And you wrote about this, and I'm plucking a quote here. When others stop reacting, you've lost power, not military power, not economic scale, but strategic centrality.
Yeah.
And you suggest there that the US is losing their centrality, particularly in the global south. So, how are countries reducing their dependence on the US, and what does that mean for Australia, who really seems to be last in this musical chairs game to really make a decision in its national interest regarding Washington?
Yeah, the decentering of the United States has been unfolding now for really 30 years. And this has been something that began ironically after the United States became quite obviously the only and single superpower in the early 1990s, in large part through its own actions, underpinned by hubris and its ambitions to assert American liberalism around the world, etc., etc. But also in part because of mainly China's economic development and to a much lesser extent, and in the recent 2 decades or so, Russia's rejuvenation. We have seen the economies of what we now call the global south emerge as significant economic forces in and of themselves. If you think back 30 years ago, almost all countries of the world had the United States as its principal trading partner and also as its principal provider of investment finance, should that have been made available, either directly or indirectly through US dollars channeled through the IMF and such international multilateral funding institutions. Wind forward to today, and the overwhelming majority of countries in the world have China as its principal trading partner, and and that continues to grow. The United States market now represents about 14% or thereabouts of global imports, compared to about 25% a generation and a half ago. And that basically means that the US market is simply not as important in relative terms as it once was. The United States does continue to play an outsized role insofar as the provision of finance capital is concerned, but that role is also diminishing in part because of the weaponization of the US dollar and its associated institutions, and also by virtue of, again, the rise of China and China's own ability to finance significant economic activities around the world, much of which has been undertaken through or under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative. So these changes that have been taking place are fundamentally reshaping the contours of international value flow. And it's not to say that the US economy is not an important economy. It clearly is. It's simply to say that the world doesn't revolve around the US economy in the way that it once did. So that's the first point to sort of bear in mind. The second point to bear in mind as these transformations take place is that the trading networks that are emerging beyond what used to be the hubs and spokes relationship that existed with the United States is a lot more multidimensional. So rather than the United States being replaced simply by another hubs and spokes arrangement, we're starting to see a picture that looks more like a number of hubs and spokes with interlocking linkages. So it's a more diffused network of economic flows. And that in itself is transforming the nature of our world, right? So we're not just going from one hegemon to another. The system itself is actually changing the way that it looks and operates. So that's the second point. And a lot of that is, of course, taking place in Asia itself. So inside Asia, and particularly if you looked at, well, firstly, ASEAN and China. So ASEAN's the 10 nations of Southeast Asia. About 4 years ago, ASEAN as a whole overtook the European Union as China's most significant trading partner. And if you took a slightly broader view, which is the 15 nations of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Arrangement, we find now that over 50% of trade undertaken by those 15 nations is actually within the group of the 15 themselves. So intra-RCEP trade is now over 50% of their collective trade. Now, that again is just another dimension of the multipolarization of global economic relationships. Where does that ultimately leave Australia, I think, is, the final question. And Australia's economic relationships in some ways uh, are a bit Jekyll and Hyde. So from a trading point of view, as we all know, China is Australia's principal trading partner, and Australia's most significant trading region is Asia. So from a trade point of view, Asia is where Australia's bread is buttered. However, from a capital point of view, the United States has remained Australia's most significant provider of capital inflows, and in fact, the overwhelming majority of Australian publicly listed companies, the top 20 publicly listed companies, are actually dominated by American institutional investors, right? So American capital continues to play a very significant role in the life of particularly Australian capital markets, even if it's not as significant from a trade point of view. Where does Australia end up going? Well, um, uh, my own gut feeling and my own sense, and probably not just gut feeling, but if you looked at the long run patterns of economic value flows, Australia ultimately is going to need to go with where the trade is, and because without that, the lifeblood of the Australian national economy ultimately withers, and in fact, without those trading relationships, there's actually not much of a business case for the investors taking positions in Australian publicly listed companies.
Could we call that sort of capital colonization, where essentially the US is coming in with these capital flows to see us as a dominion of choice by sort of anchoring us to this money, anchoring our markets to this money, whereas the trade, the lifeblood flows tells a completely different story. Is there
Yeah.
any evidence to that?
Well, I don't think it happens in a particularly explicit way, but clearly when you control stock, you do have the capacity to influence executive decisions in companies. There is quite a lot written about the role of American capital in quantitative terms, but there's there's not a lot of evidence which suggests that American investors explicitly use that position to leverage particular outcomes. I guess it's probably nonetheless fair to say that important investors are going to have direct lines to company directors and CEOs, and they will have strong views about all sorts of matters. But remember that a lot of these companies profit by virtue of Australia's trading relationships with the rest of the world. So, from an investor's point of view, they would also want Australia to maintain and expand on those open trading relationships. But the risk that Australia runs is, of course, capital flight. And should American capital exit the Australian market, it will have an impact on market valuations on the ASX, and the sort of consequential psychological effects to start with as to what that might mean. So American capital as a category does have an ability to exert quite a lot of influence over the way in which the Australian economy um, operates, and by
A
virtue of
cudgel.
well, it can be
Yeah.
in theoretical terms. There's nothing that would stop American capital from exercising a lot more influence over the direction of Australian companies, should they so wish. And I guess from a risk management point of view, you'd want to be quite mindful of that risk.
So Albanese announcing an interest in engaging with China around AI technologies and opening up sectors of industry and trade. Is this a hedge, or a way of being able to put a few eggs outside of the US basket into the region? And I also want to talk about ASEAN in relation to that. We see Indonesia recently developing a green nickel project with China, where they kind of, pushed China to invest in this project. And it made our Western Australian nickel industry a Stone Age enterprise from that case since. I think it closed down a large section of it. Are we missing out? I mean, when I saw Penny Wong hosting the ASEAN Summit in Melbourne, it just seemed like her and the Philippines standing next to each other, wagging their fingers at the rest of the members about their need to contain China. It seems like her recent visit now that's shifted quite a fair bit. The language, the open palms, and all this sort of stuff. You spoke about that recent ASEAN summit, and I just sort of wanted to ask you, why was that summit significant? You mentioned it was a pivotal moment. And how does it reflect the broader shift towards, potentially what you're working on, currency multipolarity and decentralized global governance?
Yeah, look, this ASEAN event that we're talking about is the ASEAN-China Gulf States event, right? So, and that's principally the economies of the Middle East. That was an important event, right? Because what you've got is three of the most significant real economy regions of the world building institutional relationships that went beyond bilateral relationships. So, as I mentioned earlier, China has had a long-standing and deepening relationship with ASEAN. Interestingly, I should also add, as an aside, almost all of the countries of Asia have a very different attitude towards how they should relate to China than Australia does. They're much closer. They've actually had millennia of experience in these relationships, and there seems to be it seems that they're actually far more relaxed generally about China's role in the region and how they can best manage that from their own point of view, but also how they can harness that to their own national prosperity and peace interests. But this trilateral summit between the Gulf states, ASEAN and China, was the first of its kind, and it really sent a clear message to the world that these three anchor points of global real economy capability, meaning energy and food, together with large consumer markets, were working to become more aligned and more coordinated. The the China Gulf state relationships has also been quite strong. It's obviously the Gulf states have been a supplier of oil to China for a long time, and increasingly, China is now a supplier of all sorts of technologies to Gulf state countries in renewable energies as well as in digital systems, rail lines, and smart cities. Right, so the complementarities are deep, they're extensive, and also reaching to a point where the Gulf states have been building financial instruments and financial institutional hookups with Chinese financial institutions, mainly at a market-to-market level, that enable capital flows to take place between these regions in a managed and governed way. So these elements or these layers are all starting to come together, which enables these parts of the world to find strength in their coordination, in part as a way of dealing with external pressures. So when a nation is looking to manage its external risks, it's in part looking to ensure that it has options, and that is not exposed to the unilateral whims of any one particular party. And I think that this trilateral summit really opens that out. It's also worth bearing in mind, by the way, that these relationships between these three parts of the world aren't new. These are relationships that were very active almost 2,000 years ago. when the Persian Empire and the Chinese dynastic empires traded significantly through the land corridors of the Silk Road and also through the maritime corridors, which ultimately saw the development of incredible entrepot cities throughout Asia, including in the Philippines and of course, on the Malay Peninsula.
And the advertising campaign out of Beijing has really been sort of focusing on these traditional linkages. I've seen something in Central Asia. There was an opera they composed or something that was about this exchange between these two great cultures in Central Asia and China. It seems like many realists in engaging with China now are determining that they are a potential partner of choice, and from even Japan and Korea right now, the way they're hedging their bet is to engage with Beijing on a bilateral basis, away from the sort of whisperings of Washington. Australia seems to be somewhat traditionally aware of China's ability to be a reliable partner of choice. And based on the election cycles of the US and the tumult that we expect every 4 years or so, is there now evidence that China is a more beneficial partner of choice for Australia in the long term? And just to counter all the propaganda in Australia that is really driven towards creating some kind of yellow peril hysteria, it feels sometimes, based around the fear of China's expansion. Do you think that these two lines contrast the reality of China and what they're trying to achieve in the region? And I'm talking also about Confucian metrics of what power is compared to the West, as opposed to economic expansion as opposed to military dominance. And so the question is, do you think China is a more reliable partner of choice moving in the middle to long term?
Well, I look at it this way. Australia has long had a difficult relationship with Asia, including China, going back to the time of the goldfields and, of course, the period in the late 1800s through to the early 1900s, covered by David Walker in his book, The Anxious Nation. So Australia has had a very anxious-ridden relationship with Asia. It's also had a very difficult relationship with China right through the post-war period, particularly around the yellow peril / reds under the bed period, right? So Australia does have a long-standing cultural predilection to discomfort in relation to Asia. It might want to say otherwise, but the historical evidence is that for a long period of Australia's history, it has sought to be predominantly a white settler nation. White Australia was amongst the first sets of legislation that was passed by the new Australian Parliament after Federation, right? So it has been a defining character of Australia as a modern nation. I don't think that those anxieties are ones that will disappear quickly. They may be affected in time by demographic change, and of course, that is being underpinned by periods of Asian immigration, which clearly also provokes anxious responses from certain quarters of the Australian body politic. We've seen that in the 1990s, and we've seen that more recently as well. So I don't think that Australia is going to somehow have. So I say this as an observer rather than advocating a particular sort of view of the world. But I don't think that Australia is going to have some kind of a rapid road to Damascus change in perspectives in relation to China. So that's the first thing. It's going to have a difficult relationship for the foreseeable future. But as we touched on at the outset, there is an ongoing and, in fact, a more active public discussion, debate, conversation about China in the 21st century and what that means for Asia at large and Australia's role within the region. So it's a debate that Australia is going to have. I wouldn't be surprised if the preference is for the issues to ultimately settle themselves through the passage of time. But in the meantime, there are clearly some very animated views about China that in effect allege that China represents or poses a significant existential risk to Australia. But none of those views have ever articulated and demonstrated exactly why that's the case. They have actually drawn from that history that I touched on, which is that China has provoked anxious responses of fear and difference and things like that, to ultimately create further anxieties about why Australia needs to do something about this supposed China threat. Put aside Chinese intentions, most defence planners would actually say, look, what you've got to look at is capability, right? So it's not about intentions at all; it's about capability. And I don't think that there is anyone serious who will actually say to you that China has a capability of doing anything to Australian national security in a meaningful and permanent way. So I think most of this stuff around the China fear is a furphy. It is very easy to provoke and to whip up, but at the end of the day, this seems to be an episode that Australia as a country is just going to have to go through. Look, a lot of this is going to ultimately be determined in Washington, right? I often say to people that Australia's attitudes towards China will change when Washington's attitude towards China changes, and I suspect that that's likely to be the case.
And in that void, there could be a unique take on that relationship that develops in Australia, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, Australia is in a position where it can think seriously about the role it wants to play within the region at large, and one that is uniquely Australian based on its geography and its economic position, as well as its own, culture and social background, that does not depend upon a green light from Washington, right? And that really, I think, is the challenge that is posed by the present period: is can Australia activate a political imagination that allows it and enables it to transcend its own historical limitations? Because the other book that's a very interesting, other than David Walker's one about the anxious nation, is Kim Gyngell's book, which talked about Australia's fear of abandonment. And I often think that these are the bookends to understanding Australia's broad posture. And Australia actually has nothing to fear. There is no reason why it should fear abandonment by great transatlantic protectors, because Australia has the capacity, both geographically, economically, and in terms of a population of intelligent human beings, to navigate the circumstances in which it finds itself and to make constructive contributions to not only national peace and prosperity, but actually regional peace and prosperity.
We've got the fall of Singapore on the brain, and we need to be looking a little bit further out now. Maybe we could rejourney to the west or something like that, and get some tips about how we can sort of explore the region with a little bit more of an open, shiny eyes and a bit of a bushy tail. Thank you so much for being here, Warwick. It's been a pleasure meeting you and speaking to you. And the guests are going to get a lot out of this one, I can guarantee. Could I potentially ask you back to speak on
Sure.
sometime again? It's just such a fascinating insight coming from yourself, and I can imagine the developments over the next months and years ahead are going to require some insight from yourself. So thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you and happy to come back.
Appreciate it, Warwick. Thanks.